Microsoft intends to create an entirely new product category with the Surface Duo. But those of you familiar with the space will know that this isn't the first dual-screen smartphone. Now, Microsoft isn't really even calling this a phone, but there are a lot of similarities to earlier devices released in the market, like the ZTE Axon M. Now, the ZTE Axon M was released back in 2017 as a partnership between ZTE and AT&T in the United States. And it was really the first well-thought-out dual-screen phone with custom software and custom hardware. Now, notably, it didn't perform as well. It had lackluster performance and not great software. But how does the Surface Duo compare to the Axon M? And was Microsoft able to learn something and, notably, able to create a category where ZTE couldn't? This is NOISO, and this is the Microsoft Surface Duo versus its predecessor, the ZTE Axon M. Now, before you jump into the comments to point out that the Axon M wasn't in fact the first dual-screen phone, I know. The Kyocera Echo was actually the first dual-screen Android phone, released all the way back in 2011. Now, there's not much to say about the Kyocera Echo now because generally the performance, as expected, is quite terrible. It's difficult to use, but thankfully my model does still turn on. The one redeeming quality of the Kyocera Echo was that it had the most interesting and cool flip-out hinge. Well, let's get back to the main event, the Axon M. Now, it's tough to imagine anyone would be comparing this versus the Surface Duo today for actually purchasing, because this is going for less than a tenth of the price you can get the Surface Duo for. But it is interesting to compare the hardware and the software differences and figure out, did Microsoft actually look much at the ZTE Axon M when they were developing the Surface Duo? From a hardware standpoint, the two of these have some similarities. They're both generally metal and glass builds. They both have side-mounted fingerprint sensors and massive bezels. Now, the Axon's bezels are a little bit more easy to forgive considering they were released in 2017, the same year that the iPhone 8 and the iPhone X were released. So really the back end of big bezels. The Surface Duo, on the other hand, does have very large bezels, but you could say at least you have a big screen to compensate for that. The hinges of the two devices are quite different, with the Surface Duos having a very, very smooth action that rotates all the way around, whereas the Axon M having a more clicky action that snaps into place, or snaps closed. Generally, the Axon M's metal back makes it more durable for wear and tear, but I will say, since by design the screens are always open, you do have the concern that you might scratch up the screens if you put it on a hard surface. Now, in my couple months of use, I did notice I did get some scratches on the screens, but considering how cheap this device is now, it wasn't as big of a deal. Whereas the Surface Duo does close its screens inside when you close the phone just like this, which kind of protects the screens. Now, you don't want anything caught between them though. Generally, the Axon M feels like a metal brick that you might be able to toss around a little without it getting too damaged, whereas the Surface Duo feels more like a piece of jewelry that you want to handle quite delicately. For one-handed use, it's no contest. The Axon M, despite being quite a bit thicker, is significantly easier to use in one hand because it's not quite as wide as the Surface Duo. And the design of the screens is quite different in that the Axon M has a thicker single piece with an ancillary screen on top of it, whereas the Surface Duo has two equally sized pieces. Now, while you could criticize the Axon M for not being symmetrical, I would say that it feels more like you have a single primary main screen with an ancillary screen when you need it. Generally, there's no reason to only use the second screen, except for maybe when you're using the camera, which we'll get to later. Whereas the Duo doesn't really differentiate between its two screens, so you can freely switch back and forth between them. I'm not sure why you would necessarily do so, but you have that option. For the displays, the Surface Duo clearly benefits from being newer, as the OLED displays are quite a bit brighter, more colorful, and more appealing to look at. Whereas the LCD on the Axon M are really not too impressive. Now, while the Surface Duo does impressively keep the screens very close together with a really tight hinge, it actually isn't as close or as tight as the Axon M's, which slims the bezel to be incredibly small, and so the gap between the two screens is actually quite a bit smaller. Now, as far as software goes, the controls of the two screens in both operating systems are relatively similar in that you have the options to just display something on one screen, display two different apps in two different screens, or to span an app across both screens. Now, while the Axon screens only add up to 6.8 inches compared to the 8-inch Surface Duo's canvas, which is almost as big as a lot of tablets, the way that they handle content is quite different. Now, notably, the Axon M with the smaller gap will separate content into two different pieces, meaning that you're not missing anything that will look a little weird with your two content spread across the gap. Whereas the Surface Duo does erase content in the gap, meaning that if there's something that appears in the middle of the screen, it will just disappear. We'll talk a lot more about this during my full review, but just so you know, I'm not happy about it. Now, both of these devices sport one single camera that sits on one side of the device. And surprisingly, the Axon M's is not terrible considering how old it is. Now, it was never competitive with some of the other big flagships released in 2017, but it's got a big enough sensor that it works quite well with regular pictures, at least for 2017, and for selfies, it's better than a lot of other phones. Now, I wouldn't really compare it to most devices from 2020, but the Surface Duo's camera is also a single sensor that works for both selfies and regular pictures. And the photos that come out of it, I'll talk about more in the review, but they're definitely not top tier or flagship tier. Now, both the devices' software force you to flip to the other screen when you're using the camera towards the other direction, whether it be selfie or a regular landscape photo. But notably, the Axon M seems to handle it a little bit more elegantly with the dedicated button rather than trying to sense when you're flipping the device a certain way. I know that this is a big bug for a lot of people on the Surface Duo, so I'm sure that software updates will get further. In 2017, I generally could forgive a camera like this on the Axon M. In 2020, the camera on the Surface Duo is a little bit tougher to forgive, especially with more and more manufacturers adding more and more sensors to their phones. Now for the million-dollar question, can Microsoft's Surface Duo achieve what the Axon M couldn't? Notably, Microsoft is a trillion-dollar company with a lot of resources that they could invest in making the Surface Duo a very impressive device. But let's not forget that ZTE was a top 5 manufacturer in the US the year that they released the Axon M. They had sold more phones than Nokia, Motorola, and OnePlus combined. And so they weren't small change. Now, notably, they got into a lot of hot water shortly after the release of the Axon M that could have led to the Axon M's lack of success. But Microsoft has a lot of work to do before they can make the Surface Duo a very compelling device for everyone. I'll be going into full detail on my experience with the Surface Duo in my upcoming review, so be sure to subscribe for that. If you ever got the experience of using or seeing an Axon M in person, let me know down in the comments what you think. If you like this video, be sure to like it. I'll see you in the next one.